Hello, and how's everybody doing? My name is Graham Nolan, co-chair of Storytelling and Partnerships for Do the Work. Our guests will be going live on camera any second now, but just welcoming you all to this discussion, which is part two of our two-part series on AI and LGBTQ plus marketing. Per our description, as promised, we're going to continually push beyond the boundaries of AI in speaking to our queer consumer base, which is obviously a growing demo in this country with a lot of buying power. AI tech panders to a wide audience and does its best not to anger or challenge its assumed social norms, but that's not good enough for a community who demands new conversations and real human rights. Basically, there are standards being set for this technology that are pretty much like in line with the status quo of, of human rights in this country, of policy in this country. The whole nature of the technology is to aggregate from what already exists. One of the ways in which we still lead is the ability to, project a future that we want. That's something that the computers are not able to do yet with the sort of imagination and power that we can. So I'm like I say yet because I'm like a fan of sci-fi and I always like envision like robot futures. So bear with me. Um, but it's there's so much about the status quo that's being reflected in this technology that is just sort of exacerbating some existing challenges that we have in this society. Content and rights, and legality, and the careers of the people who are charged with usually creating content. I think that one of the biggest discussions that we always hear is that people's jobs are threatened. There are apparently studies that sort of indicate that within the advertising and marketing industry, it's junior positions that are disappearing, and that may be in large part due to AI. There's also all these elements that like environmental impact. So there's also studies. We actually issued one in our new Queerly report through our newsletter that sort of showed the link between like businesses that do well with queerness and representation and those that do well with sustainability. And that's not to mention all of the, ethical and representation issues that we have in society that are just sort of, again, being magnified by this technology and the way that it sort of spits back the most, hyper versions of what's already out there, which is why I want to say it was in the part one of this series, the first time I heard anyone casually use the term abs and flags in terms of what came out of searches when you search for LGBTQ content. It's like, make me an LGBTQ Halloween image, and it's just like someone with abs and a holiday sweater or like a ghost costume, and then like holding pride flags. So it's just like the algorithm doesn't get us. It just sort of gets all these sort of parodies of us. So we want to talk about in that session, the first part, we also talked about um, a lot about some of the we talked a lot about the ethics, but we also talked a lot about some of the tactics. If anyone was sort of was there, you saw that we started with the demonstration of like what ChatGPT thinks of LGBTQ marketing and how much of it that was interesting because it was sort of accurate and how much was interesting because it's inaccurate. And I think, we'll certainly have some conversation about like the effectiveness or fallibility of some of these technologies. But what I really want to focus on with our amazing speakers today is community response. So I think that there's 1,000 places that you can go to find out what apps you should be using and what, large language models you should be using and how you should be applying them for efficiencies and for coding and all of these things. But I want to talk about like how it's impacting us as consumers. I want to talk about how it's impacting us as a marketing and advertising industry. And I specifically want to get to a place because we are called Do the Work where we can talk about how we can get involved in shaping this. So, just for context, again, if I haven't said, I'm Graham Nolan, he, him pronouns, gay man based now in Brooklyn, New York. I am also Hispanic. I'm also a stand-up comedian. I am also neurodivergence as far as depression goes, which seems pretty relevant for how dark it is outside this window. So I'm all sorts of things, and that's what I'm bringing to the conversation. I want to introduce our speakers so they can introduce themselves, and then we can just sort of get into unpacking what's up with the robots. Diego, you can go first.
Hey, I am Diego Andrade, he, him. I am a queer Mexican. I'm technically, Mexican immigrant, Mexican born, but I consider myself first gen because I was raised pretty much exclusively here in the U.S.
Okay.
So there's some nuance there. I'm an executive creative director for Orsi, which is a multi-segment agency. So I do a lot of work with diverse communities, including queer segments in advertising and direct campaigns. So that's kind of my deal.
Very cool. And as a fellow X-Men fan, we won't go too far down this road. We are both afraid of the robots because we know that the Sentinels are coming. So watch
Exactly.
X-Men 97 if you don't know what that means and live in fear with us. Catherine, you're up.
Hi, I'm Catherine Diaz. Pronouns are she, her. I am Filipino and naturalized American as of last year. I am currently living in Los Angeles, but I am moving back to Manila next week, Manila, Philippines. So it's an interesting time because I spend much of my time trying to bring in Global South narratives or more marginalized narratives into the mainstream when I talk about working in advertising or in media. I currently work in foresight and futures for a company called Foresight Factory. So I spend a lot of time thinking about what the future might look like, what might drive change, and what it might look like to bring voices in from the edge. So this is a really interesting topic for me.
Amazing. I know that you mentioned the move during our
Mhm.
our warm-up chat. I don't think that you mentioned that you were leaving the country. Or we may
Yeah.
have glossed over that or I missed it somehow because
No,
of the market,
I
which
don't.
wow.
Yeah, it's definitely a big one halfway around the world, but it'll be nice to be back home.
Amazing. Very cool.
Mhm.
Well, thank you both for being here and for and I think it's very clear where you both fit into the discussions in terms of your professional life, but we're just going to find out more about what you think. And again, I know I told you this before, but like I want to welcome first off, I want to welcome anyone who's watching live to, plug any questions in. We'll probably address them near the end, but it's nice to see what people are thinking about the topic. I also, welcome you both to, I think this is a conversation where it's kind of important as best we can to just sort of acknowledge how we feel as people about this, because I think that we're supposed to go into these things going. I actually had a really fun, quick exchange with one of our senior advisory board members earlier today. And he said that he was on a panel and he got sprung with the question at the last minute, like, what do you foresee for the next year? And so that was met with, not an atypical panel question, but like one that he wasn't prepared to answer. And this is someone who I know who is brutally honest. So all the other panelists give a, I'm really looking forward to the way that AI is doing this. And he was just like, we've got a rough year ahead, folks. You want an honest answer from me? We've got a rough year ahead. I think that there is a compulsion, and if we feel optimism, obviously express it, and we'll try to push towards some optimism in this discussion. But like, where we are feeling like wary about this as humans, we should definitely share that in this discussion. I would like to start with, we'll obviously get to the marketing conversation because that's what Do the Work is focused on. But I want to ask you, as a marketing expert, or just as a person who lives in a very digitally connected world, how has the current application of AI impacted, how have you seen it impact the LGBTQ plus community thus far? Like, there's so many conversations about what it could do and what it will do and what it might do. What is it doing to us right now?
I can chime in. I think for me, what it's doing is just confirming kind of what we already know to be true is that we live in a very cisnormative heterosexist world because it's reflecting, what's out there. The model is trained on what's available, and I think those biases are very front and center. So it's mirroring the inequities that are already in the media space because it's archiving what is put out there. So I think it's very white focused. If you don't denote a specific ethnicity, it tends to default to those kinds of models, and same thing with cisnormative and heterosexist imagery. It's just always going to the default or regressing to the mean, as it were. So I think for me it's just highlighting kind of that in a more stark way.
And how does that make you feel about what's next? Do you think it'll be more of the same, or do you think it sort of lays forth the problem so so everyone knows what they have to fix?
I think it's the latter for me. I think it just shows kind of what we have to do, and kind of calls to action our active participation in this technology to make sure we're shaping it in a way that doesn't quite reflect that. And I think that's what I've done for a living for most of my career, is kind of speak, and platform voices that are underrepresented that nobody else is talking to, or stories that other folks aren't necessarily highlighting. So I think it's just it's kind of just another phase of what the work I've been doing for most of my career,
Yeah.
just with
Look at all the ways where
higher
we can
tech.
make progress for people. And those are the
Exactly.
business opportunities, right?
Hmm.
Catherine,
Yeah.
how do you see this stuff affecting society thus far?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of funny, and maybe this is a hot take to start us off with. I
Perfect.
think like for a lot of people speaking outside or think or brainstorming about how this affects the queer community, how this might affect queer creators, there is definitely a lot of fear out there. And as Diego said, right, it is reproducing a lot of the stereotypes that we have, but on the other hand, by it is in the word, it is reproducing a situation that has existed before. It is the hyper, it's sped up, it is intense, but it's not a new problem, right? That by definition, queering exists outside the mainstream. We have never been represented in the mainstream. And AI, the fact that AI doesn't sucks, but it's not new. And that's why I feel like people they're wary of it, but it is not as they're not discombobulated to use a word that I try to slip in everywhere I can.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a good one.
yeah, and so there's that. And I was talking to the benefits of living in Los Angeles. I have a lot of friends who are queer creators who are in media. And I think the way I can describe their reaction is more puzzled than anything. Like they told me, that queerness is always outside what's popular. We're always a step ahead of what's popular. We define what's popular. So how can AI market to me? Like I will set the trend that AI follows, not the other way around. And therefore, they're not really threatened by it, more puzzled. And I love this. I don't know. You can cut this out if you want, but they were like, AI feels very straight culture to me. And so they are more, it's not even a competitor to a few of them. I think, but yeah, like to your point, I think the danger is more long term, right? Once it's baked in and it is pervasive, then we have to make sure we're represented. But for now, I think people are like, okay, yeah.
It's that's a really interesting the idea that that the content and what's being pulled in is straight and the affirmation of that, it makes sense and it's great to hear it out loud, we're not surprised by this. That's good. This just sort of like sets if we're looking at like a visual, or spoken version of the internet, that's the internet, right? The idea though that like AI in and of itself is like part of straight culture is really interesting though. I because I always like a member of our leadership team at Do the Work sort of told me like, and it's sort of like therapy. It's like, sometimes you hear the same thing over and over, but you have to hear it a certain way, right? So what she said to me was, you being queer is not about like you wanting a man. It's about you wanting who you want and deciding that in whatever moment and being very present making those decisions. So in that way, queerness is inherently creative, which is like, well, shit, if you believe that, then like, the mission of Do the Work is pretty dead on because it's about like manifesting that creativity, right? So if I think about that like in sort of like very broad strokes. This is not meant to be like an absolute general, like it's a generalization, which means that it's inherently wrong and there's exceptions to it. But I've kind of thought that like, you know, queer culture is to create. I find that a lot of like feminine culture is to create, right? And like that's the very nature of like, birth. That's how birth happens a lot of the time. But and that like, and thus heteronormativity is about selling what we create. Right. So it's just like the very nature of like, there will be that sort of, the way that you're sort of positing it, Catherine, is just like, there's this like food chain and it's like, there's queer people who are still creating things. And then there's like the AI that will sort of like
Hmm.
manifest it and package it for like, and then it'll sort of reach,
Exactly.
and then it'll sort of reach everyone else in straight culture who
Mhm.
likes, and again, that is not meant to be an absolute thing, but like, how does that framework sort of strike you?
I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I think, and again, maybe that's kind of the theme of where I'm coming from, where AI is this incredibly powerful tool that is disrupting everything. I don't want to discount its effect, but at the same time, it is not. the challenge is not new. Like the idea that mainstream culture is pulling from queer culture, pulls from Black culture, pulls from young women, right? That is very, very established. And so just because you added something that can kind of collate faster and spit out the patterns, that doesn't change the fact that the originators of that culture are still queer people, Black people, young women, you're still pulling from the same source.
Yeah,
And I think
by the way,
because oh, sorry. I was gonna say, just to add on what the Catherine said, I think, I think that that makes us well suited to kind of figure out what to do with this technology, because like you said, Graham, queerness is inherently creative. We have to kind of make up our place of belonging in our families, in our social circles, in our communities. We kind of have to invent that for ourselves, because a lot of times we're not seeing, anything in front of us, or anything's been done before like we are. And I think that makes us really well suited to be the ones that actively, shape and figure out what to do with this, like Catherine said, hyper intense, super fast iterating tool,
uh,
that's already pulling from what we're contributing to wider culture anyway.
I think that I think that like I didn't mean, Catherine, to sort of take your thing and sort of like just repeat it back and be like, this is what I think, and it's just what you said. Like I'm just like trying to visualize that food chain, because
Yeah, of
Diego, what you're
course.
saying is like, what you're saying is we have a responsibility to, one, not only monitor our own behaviors as people who are at the bottom of the
Mm,
food chain sometimes, but to make sure that we are actively placing ourselves at the top of it and recognize both the, I'll Spider-Man this, power and responsibility of being at the top, right? So that's
mm-hmm,
Yeah.
that's really interesting.
mm-hmm.
And how would you, this is an extension of the first question, but how would you characterize our community's reaction to AI content to date? I had a conversation with someone who's not in advertising the other day, and their take on it, pretty unprompted even, was for I'm aware of the fact that this is hitting talent in your industry. I wish I could say that I thought advertising was better because that was happening. That like that people haven't necessarily seen advertising get better because of AI content or AI efficiencies that are supposed to free us up for more creative ideas. How do you see our community responding to like content at, we're right now, by the way, I think in the era of what, AI slop, right? So it's just like we're just seeing a lot of people sort of like play with stuff. It's not too refined. We've still got a weird number of fingers on things. So now we've all got abs, but like, 6 fingers on each hand. How do you see people respond to the content that AI is outputting?
I think they're wary. I've seen like mixed reactions, right? People are cautious, and I think, especially our community, we, for very valid reasons, are always cautious of any entity that purports to define us, or spit out what we are defining as our culture. So it's like a range. There's paranoia, but there's playfulness. I think I've seen mixed reactions, like lots of people engaging with the novelty of it all. I've seen enough Studio Ghibli thirst traps on my Instagram feed to, like, last a lifetime. And but also very, very cautious. I saw Bretman Rock did branded content with Gemini, and the comments were, very mixed. And he's a really beloved personality who is almost, not controversial at all. But even he was getting pushback about, hey, like, absolutely not. Like, how dare you partner with an entity like this? I can't believe you're doing this. So there's lots of mistrust, but there's also people just saying, oh, hey, cool, look at this thing I can make. So it's a wide range, for at least as far as I've seen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, like, and maybe this is the difficulty, right? Because even if we are only talking really about queer strategists, queer producers, it's still, we are, by definition, maybe so diverse. There's so many points of that we could take this, but also I feel like maybe it's almost weirdly, maybe in my circles at least, become almost a moral issue, right? Where you have, it's not just, am I using the tool well or not? Does my avatar have 6 fingers, or is it like perfect? Right. There is this moral judgment attached to it of, oh, are you using AI and therefore almost, especially in our field, kind of cheating, right? Cheating the creativity, cheating the work that goes into finding a real insight. But on the other hand, you have people talking about like just the excitement of this whole new creative world, right? Where I can make, I don't know what you call it here, crocus, like thumbnails or whatever, like things to show um, very quickly. And so I spend more time thinking and less time like drawing frame by frame, or just the ability to, I can create a short film on my own in an hour. And like the lure of that unlocked that the toy, but it's weird that it is become a really moral issue for us.
Yeah. It's I sort of see it. I mean, I have a lot of friends who are just sort of activisty to begin with, and I'm getting a lot. It's real. I have one friend in particular who like and I love him, and he holds me account for like I try to support a bunch of queer artists and like commission a bunch of work from them, and and if I accident once or twice I've accidentally posted something that was AI, and my friend is like, "That's AI. You support artists, right?" And I'm like, "Yes." Consistency is important, with integrity, and I think that like as long it's another thing that sort of forces us to like sort of develop our own moral code in relation to it, right? Yeah, I see the moral impact for sure. I want to say, I just want to throw out here really quick. It's really funny. I think that and this sort of speaks to some of the Studio Ghibli Thirst Trap stuff. That first, I always forget the name of it. There was that one app that everyone used for like 2 days. And it was like the one that sort of spit out like 12 different, like sort of sci-fi-ish, very like polished, like, AI portraits of you. You know which one I'm talking about, right? Like,
Is
and,
it
and
Lenza or something?
which one?
Lenza or something like
Yes,
that?
yes. And so everyone used it, and it was everyone's profile pictures for like 2 days. And I saw a lot of people post it, and then I saw half of those people comment, "Boy, this is a sign I need to get to the gym." So they mostly used it to beat themselves up. One more fucking thing, like we're complaining about advertising, like airbrushing, and like that's not what real models look like. But then we did it to ourselves, and then I also noticed with something that big, I usually just sort of like wait before I form an opinion on how afraid I am about it. And I'm talking to artist friends, and they're just like, "I'm worried about this," and I was like, I think you should note that 2 weeks after that big everyone's posting this, when everyone's, aunt in the Midwest could do the same thing, everyone sort of went back to their real profile pictures. Right. So just in terms, I'm just sort of curious if you see like people just sort of like largely, it was like it's an identification thing, but it like doesn't really matter if everyone starts to identify the same way, or starts to look the same way, or starts to be some version of themselves that like it's to me that reaffirmed what some people are saying, which is that like realism is going to start trending, because when everyone is the same sort of fake thing, then like what's the joy in that? Do you sort of see that?
I think there's a sense of novelty with these trends, and I've seen a couple of AI trends come and go. Right, Studio Ghibli is one thing. Now it's currently that trend about making an image of yourself hugging a version of your child self on a Polaroid. Like, so it's I've seen these things come and go, and I think people are treating them like almost like they do TikTok audios. Right, it's like a fun thing to participate in the moment, and then they move on. So I think it's becoming just another form of expression, and it's less like widespread and huge like the Lenza thing, and it's more just little pockets in different kind of communities and niches I'm seeing online, and people aren't treating them with as much like like, oh wow, this is so cool. It's like, oh wow, this is fun. Like, I'm now moving on with my life and I'm posting about something else. So I've seen it become a bit, I don't know if that's a normalization or if it's just becoming yet another thing that folks just post in their regular rotation of social media expression, and if that's a bit alarming. But that's kind of where I'm seeing it evolve to. It's less of a big moment in time and more just becoming this kind of like codified way of engaging on platforms.
One more little treat. Yeah, Catherine.
Oh, I know. I was just gonna say, like the way you were talking about it, Diego, and um, is that it reminds me of what they were saying of how millennials first encountered the internet, right? I assume we're all kind of the same age. We're just gonna go with that. Where you just, like we jumped on and we just made like we had all the memes and we had our Instagram. Sometimes I get a memory of like an old Instagram photo, and wow, the filters on that thing are incredible. And like our MySpace. And so we dabbled because it was new. And then eventually we settled, right? And then the next generation settled. And I wonder if, again, because this is what I do, we look for patterns, if that's kind of what's happening with AI, right? There is fear, there is potential talk about it being maybe satanic. We go crazy with the filters, and then eventually things settle down.
I love when Satanic Panic comes back. It's one of my favorite things.
Every now and then it comes around.
Yeah. I thought Gaga was gonna get away unscathed, but she didn't.
No.
So everything is shifting. Like, it's sort of funny that you say this. I want to sort of skip to this question that, like, that we go in waves, the pendulum swings in so many of these things. The market is shifting fast, like, something like Lensa will happen and it will affect everything, but then the next day we go back to normal because it's very impermanent. So things are kind of changing fast, they're kind of not. How do we currently see LGBTQ representation in advertising and marketing changed based on AI, both in front of and behind the camera? And I'm going to ask, I'm not trying to like plant an answer here. The answer may be not at all, right? The answer may be that like this is such a quiet year for LGBTQ communities in advertising because of the DEI backlash that we're not showing up in anything. So like AI is not affecting it. But like I'm wondering if you're seeing anything in front of the lens, behind the lens that is leading you to believe that like queerness and representation will change, or representation of queerness will change based on AI's presence. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I think like, well, I think your stance, like you brought up, I don't know if I am seeing it currently changing because one, to your point, we are not anywhere. And so by definition, and then you add to that that I feel like, or maybe it's my bubble, but every time we have seen a brand attempt to do something that is heavily AI, they are called out for it. The feed, the backlash is pretty strong, pretty robust. And so I don't know if, as of this moment, AI is really shifting what queer looks like. Now, when we think about decks, when you think about things behind the scenes, people pitching and saying, okay, the pitch is tomorrow. We are going to pitch LGBTQ plus product for Pride. I need a stock image, bam, AI. Then yes, maybe things are again changing behind the scenes. Maybe it is going to be something that's a little longer term. But I don't know, Diego, you would be closer to the work.
Yeah, I think exactly what you're saying, Kevin. It's kind of for me, it's more operational in the sense on the back end as far as conceptualization and pitch decks and shortening kind of the generation of mocks and composites and assets and things like that. So there is that component to it. I'm think folks are still figuring out the legalities. I know there's closed system AIs that a lot of production companies are starting to experiment with that can make it to air, so to speak. But I think most of the tools available to the civilian population aren't anything that we can like technically legally use as far as copyrighted material or branded material. So I think it's really on the back end. And what I'm also seeing, and this is maybe more in the multicultural space, is and it could be extending into the queer space as the technology evolves, but almost a false confidence of folks outside of communities being able to say, "Hey, now I can represent that. Now I can do that." I saw a live demonstration of an AI tool that could change mouth movements and overdub languages in real time. And I think in the multicultural space, creating in language content adaptations is a lot of what these agencies do. It's a lot of what my agency does. And we saw that and we're like, wow. And maybe the language isn't good enough quite yet. Maybe the translations are slightly off, but there are some folks for whom that will be good enough.
Mhm.
So I think that's kind of I'm seeing this kind of confidence of like, hey, we can be really efficient here. We don't necessarily need a subject matter expert because these tools are available to us. And that's not something I've seen widespread, but I've seen little inklings of that popping up that has me a little wary. And I think doubling down on the need for our expertise and folks from the community being present and helping, being the human voice that helps guide these tools.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that kind of sparked something for me, Diego, because, well, maybe two things. And one is just when he started talking about, dubbing the mouse movements, there is the other angle, right, which is about queer models and queer faces in front of the camera, where I don't actually need a model, right? And this has been a discussion for a long time within the industry about do we just use an AI model? And I think was it Gap or Ralph Lauren or somebody, J. Crew, just I think their entire campaign, right, is AI. Um, uh, and the second thing is when I was thinking marketing, advertising in the sense of shoots, but when you think about marketing, what is also happening that may or may not be known yet is that you can now create fake audiences. So instead of going to do focus group discussions, right, I am just going to program AI and ask them if this would be great for a Filipino population, for a queer Filipino population, for a queer American population. And to your point, exactly, it gives them the confidence to say, oh, okay, this campaign suits the needs for these people without actually having to talk to us. And so it is a new way to get us out of the loop.
I'm not, so I'm familiar with, like I said, some content that's been spit out visually. Like, I want queer people in this ad, and then abs and flags happens. Either of you been privy to any of those like like virtual focus groups, for LGBTQ people? And have they been pretty dead on, or have you heard anything about like how
Mhm,
accurate those are? Because again, they're just coming from an internet that like doesn't on the whole represent us, but we are there in pockets, right? And if this stuff can
mhm,
scrape stuff from like, like niche community sites, right? Like theoretically, this
mhm,
could be a way to hear from, I don't know, gay furry hackers, because you couldn't find them for a focus group before, but you can find a ton of their message boards, right? So like what is, I'm
mhm.
not saying that's anyone's target demo for marketing yet, but we could get there.
It could
Yes.
be.
But have you been privy to those sort of profiles?
No, because it does take a lot of setup. Because to your point, that is the dream, right? It is the dream to be like, I can't reach you. It's too small demographic, or it would take too much money to get all of you because you live everywhere. Can
Yeah.
I just scrape your messages, build basically an AI friend, right, that represents them, um, and ask them. So it does take a, a lot of setup, but one, I don't know how sophisticated it is, and two, I don't know, which is the problem, I don't know how you check if it's wrong, right?
Right.
Because even if I build it off source material like Reddit, like writing, at the end of the day, the AI is projecting what the answer will be. I'm
Well,
not actually
and
answering it. Yeah.
even if it's right though, I will say that this industry, like, they know how much buying power we have, and they always say that we'll follow the data, but then it's like the data points to like invest in us and you will make money, and then they don't do it, right? Like I've seen, I'll just be
True.
very, I'll be very blunt about this. Every single fucking study that says return to office policies are bad because the more flexibility you give people, the better, and they're just like, well, we're companies that follow the data, but also our culture
No,
mandates that everyone comes in. Yeah, so it's like, so it's funny because like
that's true.
no matter I'm just kind of curious, even if the profiles are right, will people listen to them? If the profiles are wrong,
Mm,
will people listen to them? Because this is still is an industry where like, well,
mhm.
we still assert that like, creativity, that's actually kind of heartening, the fact that we've always, even in the face of data, we've still sort of asserted that like human instinct is the best thing, right? And it's usually the
Mhm.
boss's instinct, not the junior people. But like, it's I guess what I'm saying is that like you're prompting me to like sort of think about like how much people will sort of like believe any of these outputs, and then it just sort of asserts the role of like humans in analysis of all these things, right?
I think
Mhm.
that's the critical part of it, right? I think even with these personas, and I've been privy to some projects or some kind of like theorization of what we can do with these personas more in the multicultural space and in the queer space, but ultimately, like any piece of data or any kind of information that you glean, even from traditional research methodologies, you have to decide as the human in the room what to do with that information and how to
Mm,
apply it. So I think it could be a great tool for getting a general sense or getting a vibe check of something, or seeing if something in general feels like it's trending towards the right direction. But ultimately, as the human in the room doing the creative, you have to choose what to do with that information and how to proceed, and maybe put further insight or do something else to corroborate, because that's the responsibility part. I think using any AI tool as the ultimate source of truth is quite frankly reckless. So you have to kind of be that person
mm,
analyzing what it's putting out, and what to do with it.
mhm, mhm,
Um, based on everything that we're talking about in terms of how this is informing our data streams, the way that this is informing our creative process, the way that this is informing our discussions and virtual focus groups and all these things. It's informing a lot of things for us. There's also, by the way, studies that are showing that like too much informing of us is making us dumber, that if we keep going to this stuff that we lose cognitive function, right? So we've talked a fair amount about how this is shaping consumer audiences, how this is, queer consumer audiences specifically. What will it take, back to that food chain, for us to get really active up here as advertising and queer advertising and marketing professionals and make sure that we are asserting our role so that we are affecting the way that that all of this stuff is sort of metabolized for the world. I think that like I'll be a little defeatist for a second and just say, that there's probably some people who might think, well, honestly, I can't do much if unless someone like a billionaire CEO of one of these companies that's deciding all the policy at the top and not necessarily like listening to the world, because they would rather trust an AI best friend. But like, what is it going to take for us to get involved higher up at the funnel of AI influence?
I think it's about recognizing the stakes, right? Because whether we like it or not, this kind of paradigm shifting technology is being adopted in a widespread way. And if we're not at the table, if we're not participating, then I don't think we have the means to protect ourselves. Because there's a lot of players who this year is pretty, apparent of that is that are neutral about us at best, right? Or they're cautious, or they don't want to engage if it feels like a risky maneuver. And there are other players who, don't have our best interest at heart. I just saw an article about Neon pulled a movie out of overseas distribution because they used AI tools to turn a same-sex couple in one of the
Mm,
scenes, and they turned one of them into a woman for that particular like scene. So I think the technology is there and can be used to erase us. So I think that for me, recognizing the stakes and that this isn't one that we can sit out, very valid ethical and other concerns notwithstanding, I think we need to be participating in this to be able to shape it.
Okay, so let's say that I'm already scared as hell. I get it. I already know that I could be erased. I already believe that deep fakes are a couple years away from causing like some serious violence and real problems. Now what do I do, right? Like how do I make sure that like because there's sort of a couple of different ways to do this. I can like sort of like take this to my management and try to get involved from a corporate level, or I just have to go, well, fuck it. I'm not there in the corporate ranks to do this and I won't be listened to. So I have to, again to Catherine's earlier point, like, understand that like, well, we've always been at the forefront of the zeitgeist and everything else has followed. So do we all have to sort of like become creators and become like active in or do we just have to build our own algorithms to guard our own communities? Like, what's the way? What's the way that
mhm,
we get involved is either like by either rallying our companies or as individuals to start changing this stuff if we are suitably terrified.
mhm. So I think kind of pulling from Diego, I think definitely knowing the stakes, but I think there's a really interesting tension here, and I don't know if it is a challenge for queer culture or quite a lot of multicultural places, which is that I think queer culture is incredibly generous. We're a generative culture, but by design, we're often not very legible to outsiders. We protect a lot of it. Maybe they get the 5% and that drives culture, but the 95% of what really makes queer culture that is not like, the abs and flags pride parade waving, is not legible, right? And so we have if we want queer culture to be an AI, we have to share. But how much to share, what to share, I think that becomes so deeply personal, right? But maybe that's the point. Maybe the point is like rather than aiming for let's get a unified single narrative of queerness onto AI so it can reproduce it. The idea of a multiplicity of viewpoints of what queerness looks like, just flooding the machine is
Yeah.
a better way or maybe not better but maybe a more accessible way to do it, but that does have you grapple with that question, like how much of what makes queer culture do we really want to have on the algorithm for everybody.
Knowing
um
like along
yeah,
with your prior sort of, suggestion that we might consider is that like if it's inherently a heteronormative system, how much do we want to populate it and how much do we want to play in it?
exactly. But one thing I was looking at because it's surprising to me that on Instagram, there are a lot of Afrofuturist creators on Instagram who use AI to basically, because they're not trained artists, they're not video creators, they're not producers, but to imagine what a Black liberated world would look like. And so they are actively populating the machine with AI images, using AI that is fed into AI of what Black joy looks like from a Black lens, which I find incredibly inspiring. And like the quote from one of them, his name is Mark Choi, is like, if AI is trained without us, it'll predict a world without us. You have to be part of the blueprint, not just the backdrop. So I think that's a really incredible stance to take now. How to action that, I don't know. But I think the
Yeah,
first step is just getting on it.
I will. It reminds me of how I've talked to this is anecdotal. This is not like I don't have any data behind this or anything. As we discussed in this conversation, what does that matter anyways? The I've got a handful of people where I think that partner is one of the simplest things for straight people to sort of be able to take back from queer culture. That like, if it's the idea of just like this is like sort of like the person who is going through life with me and doing this thing with me. And I've had like some queer people who are just like, and like she called her husband or partner. That's ours. Like you gotta, I'm like, it is the most, this is what we asked for. It is the most accessible, one of the most accessible ideas of this. Like, I have an aunt who is very much actively building chosen family after like, an entire Ohioan upbringing of biological family holding a certain place and that. And I have to like tell her explicitly because I'm like, no one's telling straight people like, chosen family is the thing necessarily, right? So but if we're gonna be like chosen family that's ours, partners that's ours, then we will have a cultural obstacle to our own
Mm-hmm.
participation in that place at the top. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
I think it's those are like more like you're spelling it out very nicely in terms of like the impact on that whole food chain, but like
Mm-hmm.
I see the walls. I see where it would stop right there because of stuff in conversations where people are like that, that's ours. And like
Exactly.
we, as soon as anyone, starts saying like boots the house down, we start making fun of them for saying it the wrong way. Like, and for good reason though, right? Because it is ours, right? So we have to like that's the one I was like, what does boots the what? It's like, okay, yeah. So we have and Diego, you had sort of voiced beforehand that you want to tackle this one first. So this is the one I'm gonna sort of throw your way. But like um we've talked about what AI is doing for LGBTQ people in advertising from a marketing and advertising perspective, which is to say, not much yet. And if any of it, it's going to be behind the scenes and we have to negotiate that. And also, like in the long term, we have to figure out how we're going to be like the people at the top of this who understand our role in pushing this down. There's a lot of long-term progress that's going to happen here. Not a ton has changed effectively for us yet. But I just went to the Dua Lipa show last year, or last week. Radical optimism is a phrase on my brain. Let's be radically optimistic for a second, and let's ask, what is the best thing that AI could do right now for queer people from an advertising and marketing perspective? What do you think we could be doing tomorrow if like we had a few people that were like ready to rally around it?
So I think for me, it might function as kind of an equalizer. And this is conversations I've been having with colleagues of mine, where it's kind of closing the gap between folks who can scale at a certain size and at a certain pace and smaller entities, right? I think anyone who works in multicultural or queer segments specifically in advertising, we're used to being scrappy. We're used to having smaller scopes and smaller budgets. We don't have as much to throw around as the global networks or the holdcos, especially as independent shops. And when everyone's able to output at a rate and at a level of quality that is more or less consistent because of tools like this, then the differentiator that you bring to the table is your creativity, is your insightfulness, is your humanity. And I think that's something that we as a community have always really excelled at. Our culture is inherently generative, as we've been talking about. So for me, I think execution becoming democratized in a way where everyone's able to kind of operate on the same playing field at the same level because the tools that are making it more accessible. And I'm seeing it in my teams internally, right? My copywriters all of a sudden have a way to visualize their ideas that wasn't accessible to them before. My art directors can play with their tonality and their language because of tools like this. And I think it's already starting to kind of stratify a little bit and make us kind of more well-rounded creatives in that regard. And I can imagine this happening on a larger scale, especially folks that tend to focus in advertising on these segments tend to not have as many resources to work with, and being able to operate at the same level is kind of that light at the end of the tunnel for me.
So it's sort of about like production equality, like the everyone has, if everyone has this thing in their phone, like exact same thing. It doesn't lead to equity necessarily right off the bat, but like it's one more step there. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Catherine, what's your
Yeah.
big like, wish for, things could be better if they did this now?
So you mean the same question as Diego,
Yeah,
right?
same
Oh
question.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So I'm gonna kind of it's basically the same thing Diego said, but kind of just
Oh, great.
expand on it when you're talking about that bigger stage, which is to kind of bring in that, I guess, global lens, which is I'm from the Philippines, where there is a lot of respect for story and craft. If you know a Filipino, you know we just like to entertain everybody, and so it's like we're big on story, and but resources are hard to come by. People have to be scrappy. We speak English, but it can be a little quirky. Same thing for me. I'm Filipino and I am baffled by American work culture. It is not my culture. It's not natural to me. I'm also autistic and an awkward bisexual. So talking corporate does not come naturally to me at all. And so on both those levels, personal and like on the Philippine creative scale, AI is a tool not necessarily for us to like make our movies on our own, but to help queer creators or queer strategists sell in their ideas, right? It helps me write. This is actually with it helps doctors, it helps people for whom English is not their first language, write the pitch in a jargon that might be more familiar to a Netflix producer or to a big client to create, as Diego said, exactly a short film that showcases how that idea might work. It helps us scale things that might have been really culturally specific, really deep into queer culture, like a deep cut, that might otherwise have a hard time being made. It helps us make the case in a way that the powers that be or whatever can understand. Yeah.
There's a commercial that we are still trying to make for Do the Work, and it's inherently a queer story. Surprise. Someone ran it through ChatGPT in like 24 hours in the early days of ChatGPT, and the way that they spit it out, it was such a queer story, but like the storyboards looked looked straight as hell. It was such a straight, like, oh, this thing doesn't know what gay people are, and then someone else saw those and played with it for a couple days and then spit out something that actually, like, not bad. Still pretty heteronormative in terms of the visual style of this, but like certainly enough where it's like, but I think if I showed people this and it's like this but gayer, they would be like, yes, thank you. Like, that you can, even if it's like wrong, you could say,
Mm-hmm.
I'm just like, I do this with PR all the time. I'm like, I wrote the wrong thing so that you can
Mm,
tell me it's wrong in this way and it needs to be fixed this way, right? So sometimes it's just about
yes,
giving people something to respond to. Um,
exactly.
I know we're nearly at time, so I want to end on a very like I think these conversations get very lofty. They get
Mm,
about the future. They can we talked before the session started about like how this gets very philosophical. So like behaviorally, what behavior are you personally engaging in to make sure you're prepared for what's next? And to not even maybe it's something to do to like put yourself at the top of that food chain in terms of how like we influence AI, but maybe it's just something a little bit more like incremental. So do you to just sort of like wrap? Do you have anything that you're doing or would suggest that other people do if they want to assert their power in this space or make sure that they were exploring it properly?
I would say engage with the tools that are out there. I think just knowing what the capabilities of this technology are and being familiar with them. So I try to like stay on top of updates or see what's going on. I experiment with a bunch of different tools, even the ones that aren't necessarily related to my discipline. I at least know what they can do, and it becomes easier to spot. Although it's becoming increasingly difficult to spot AI generations, but having a working knowledge of what these tools can do and having at least a passing familiarity with their function is, I think, the base level thing you can do that anybody can engage with, to kind of know what's going on. Because going back to our discussion about X-Men, the master mold's here. It's awake, and we have to
Yes.
mold it and shape it before it shapes us.
Before it starts spitting
mm,
out sentinels. It's really I will say, and I say this for total transparency, and this is something where like as a PR person, I would not super brag about this, but like that's actually something where I do kind of badly because like for example, when Clubhouse came out, everyone was talking about Clubhouse. You cannot be in PR and not know about Clubhouse. And I was just like, I know you're all talking about it and I know what it can do. Like I'm not on TikTok. I know what TikTok does, right? It's but I still ask questions about like my answer to this question would be that like I'm still asking questions about, so like what are you going to do about it, mostly in terms of like the ethical and the process stuff, right? So I there's stats that show that like a lot of people are sort of using this in their day-to-day jobs in marketing, but a lot of people aren't yet. And I guess I say this just to be representation for the people who aren't, so they don't seem ashamed. Like I'm not disengaged from this, and I don't pretend it's not going to affect me, but I do like I do sort of like just talk. My behavior is to just try to like find out how people are using it versus using it that same way myself because it's going to change in a year anyways, right? Like I was always like I waited forever to get the iPhone because I'm like let me wait till I could do what I wanted to do, and then I jumped in, right? Anyways, I just throw that in to be the you're giving great advice. I don't follow it because I am just not that kind of like tech adopter. But it doesn't mean that like I'm disengaged necessarily. Catherine, what do you what's your behavior that you carry out or you would suggest that people carry out to make sure that they are finding their way in this?
Yeah, so I think maybe it's a balance to Diego's, which is, you know, and I basically said the same thing over and over for this conversation, which is this is not necessarily a new fight. And so the solution to me is not new either, especially when we think about AI's impact on younger queer folk, which is really we should just all be mother. Let us protect our younger queer folk, nurture the younger queer folk. They're the ones who are going to need protection to make it to a point where they can stand and decide about AI, give them a home, teach them, but also build coalitions with queer global south creatives, queer creatives sitting outside, right? Um, to your point, you're going to learn about AI one way or another. So, like, let's not, at the end of the day, it's a tool. The work is going, do the work. It'll be the same work, right?
Yeah.
Which is community. Oh, and make great shit. That's very important.
Hey,
Like,
look,
great shit, that's good.
that reflects very well on that's a nice conclusion because it's sort of like these conversations are very important. Our ability to there's a lot of in our politically charged world, people can disagree and like be friends, and it's like that doesn't apply to everything. But like here, it's like it's so good to hear contrasting opinions. It's good to like know that like you've got the person who jumps in and like learns every technology as soon as it happens. That you've got the person who's sort of like prudent and says like let's see what's happening with this, right? It's really and to understand that like ultimately, yeah, that's about building community and to make sure that like all of our perspectives are represented, which is the whole point of this organization and these discussions. So I thank you very much for exemplifying the best of what we're trying to do here in a setting that is very much focused on like how these things are going to shape our future. I do want to ask how people can reach you. So if you don't mind sharing how people can get in touch with you after this, if they would like to keep forming community. Diego, you want to go first? Just because again, you're
For sure,
still on
yeah.
the upper left of my screen.
No worries. I'm Diego Andrade on LinkedIn and at the Andrade Sauce. My middle name is Saucedo. I always feel like I have to explain that it's not the word sauce. The Andrade
Mm,
Sauce on Instagram. So any of those platforms, I'm active, I'm available.
yeah.
Fantastic. Catherine, how do
And
people reach you?
you can find me on LinkedIn at Catherine Diaz. That's probably the best way.
Fantastic. You could follow Do the Work at Do the Work. I'm at Graham Nolan on LinkedIn. And yeah, you can email me at grahamnolan@gmail.com if you're interested in getting involved in these sorts of discussions or the volunteerism that we do to take these ideas into the world and actually do things with them, hence the name Do the Work. I want to give a big thank you to our to anyone who's tuned in live, to anyone who's watching on a delay. I also want to thank our amazing production team and our social team and our promotion team and all the people who are behind the scenes making this happen. You all, anyone who's in this business knows that this doesn't happen with just like, half an hour of prep time. It takes a village. And yeah, I just thank you for being part of the discussion, our amazing guests, and we will see you all next month. Cool. Have a good
Thank
night, everyone.
you. Good
Thank
night,
you.
everybody.
Bye.
Later.